Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Siri Hustvedt presenting her latest book, Mothers, Fathers, and Others, Essays. She'll be in conversation with Danielle Spencer. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our ever-growing digital community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Although this event wraps up our fall event season, we're already starting to fill up our 2022 calendar, which appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. This time of year, we also have lots of gift ideas on there too. After the introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to order a copy of Siri's book. Your purchases and financial contributions, I'll also share a link to donate, make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever, support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event also has closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past year and a half, technical issues might arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. Siri Hustvedt is an author and a scholar. Her published work includes critically acclaimed novels such as The Blazing World and Memories of the Future, essay collections like A Woman Looking at Men, Looking at Women, and a book of poetry. And if that's not impressive enough, she's a lecturer in psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College. She's been honored with the Princess of Asturias Award for Literature, the European Charles Vallon Essay Prize, an American Academy of the Arts and Letters Award in Literature, and the LA Times Book Prize for Fiction, as well as having been longlisted for the Booker. Tonight, she'll be talking with Danielle Spencer, author and academic director of the Columbia University Narrative Medicine Program. You may be familiar with her books, Metanosis, Revelatory Narratives of Health and Identity, and The Principles and Practice of Narrative Medicine. She's been recognized by both McDowell and Yaddo and worked with David Byrne, which is incredibly cool. As you may have guessed from that brief biographical sketch, it is nearly impossible to classify Siri Hustvedt. What connects all her endeavors are her intellect and curiosity, both of which are on display in her new collection of essays, Mothers, Fathers, and Others. For those of you most familiar with her fiction, prepare to be knocked out by this incisive and thoughtful collection. The LA Times named it one of their most anticipated books of the season. In a starred review, Kirkus calls it brilliant and utterly transfixing. And in another starred review, Publishers Weekly says, in her typical fashion, Hustvedt pulls from psychoanalysis, philosophy, literature, and art criticism to make brilliant connections among her takes on the world. Fans of her work will welcome this, and those less familiar will delight in discovering her witty and lavish style. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to tonight's speakers. Siri and Danielle, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you. We're here.
Thanks so much, Claire. Siri, it's so great to be here with you. Here.
Virtual here, yeah.
Virtually here, yeah. I wish we could be in person together. That would have been fun, but we'll do that again someday. But before we dive in, let me just say how excited I am to be talking to you tonight. I loved this collection of essays, but the truth is that I would actually inhale anything that you wrote and published, as I've done for years. It's such a rich collection, and there's so much to talk about. So why don't we begin at the beginning? And if I can ask you to read a little bit from the beginning of the first essay in the collection.
Yes, I will. This is the first page of the book, and the essay is called Tilly. My paternal grandmother was ornery, fat, and formidable. She cackled when she laughed, brooded for reasons known only to her, barked out her sometimes alarming opinions, and spoke a Norwegian dialect impenetrable to me. Although she was born in the United States, she never mastered the TH sound in English and opted for a straight T instead, referring to tings and thunderstorms and Thanksgiving. When I was a child, her hair was thick and white, and when loose, it fell almost to her waist. Before I knew her, it had been auburn. It thinned over the years, but I remember my awe when I saw it down. This happened only at night after she had unpinned her bun in front of the hazy mirror in the tiny, musty, mildewed bedroom of the farmhouse where she lived with my grandfather, who had his own even smaller room under the eaves, just up the narrow wooden steps on a floor we were rarely allowed to visit. Once her hair had fallen and her nightgown was on, my grandmother took out her teeth and put them in a glass by the bed, an act that fascinated me and my sister Leave because we had no body parts that could be removed at night and replaced in the morning. The extractable teeth, however, were only one piece of an altogether marvelous, if sometimes intimidating being. Our grandmother peeled potatoes with a paring knife at what seemed to me the speed of light, hauled logs from the woodpile near the house, and yanked open the heavy door to the root cellar with a single gesture as strong as any man's before she led us down to the cold, dank domain where canned goods stood in their glass jars on shelves lined up against earthen walls. It was a place that smelled of the grave, a thought that may or may not have occurred to me then, but the excursion was always accompanied by a whiff of threat, by the fantasy that I would be left below with the jars and the snakes and the ghosts in blackness. She was the only grown-up we knew who enjoyed telling poop jokes. She rocked with laughter over our plop plop funnies as if she were a child herself. And when she was in a good mood, she told us stories from the long lost days of her own childhood, how she had learned to turn handsprings and cartwheels and walk on a wire, and how she and her brothers hoisted sails on their sleds and were blown hard and fast across the frozen lake near the farm where she grew up. Before we went visiting, a word that signaled we were about to hop in the old Ford and call on various neighbors, Grandma put on her straw hat with the flowers on it that hung on a hook inside the front door and grabbed her black handbag with the gold clasp that had her little coin purse inside it, and we were off. My grandmother died when she was 98. She has been a ghost in my life for some time, but she has been returning lately in a mental image. I see Matilda Underdahl Hustvedt coming toward me carrying 2 heavy pails of water. Behind her is the rusted hand pump that still stands on the property, and behind the pump are the stones which were once the foundation of the old barn that had been torn down long before I was born. It is summer. I see my grandmother's cotton house dress buttoned up the front. I see her low breasts, wide body, and thick legs. I see the loose flesh under her arms jiggle as she walks, straight-armed with the enameled metal buckets. And I see her fierce, red-rimmed, sunken eyes behind her glasses. I feel the heat of the sun and the hot wind that blows across the undulating flats of rural Minnesota. I see an immense sky and the broad blank horizon interrupted by copses of trees. The memory image is accompanied by a mixture of satisfaction and pain. So it starts with my grandmother.
Thank you. I wonder if you can speak a bit about the decision to begin this essay in the collection with this description of your grandmother. There's so much beautiful physicality in the description. The fatness, hair, teeth, all of the cellar, even poop,
Yes,
laughter, flesh, the body is there at the beginning. So
yeah.
can you speak a bit
Well,
about that?
Yes, I really do believe, as you know, philosophically, and that we are embodied beings. And, for much of the history of the West, the body has been demeaned, put down, and separated from the intellect. And I really am one of those people who thinks they're unified. But when we remember others, and my grandmother's been dead for a long time, I certainly remember their bodily presences, and I also write about my own mother in this collection, who is also dead. She died in 2019. And my recollections of her are very physical. And in my dreams, she appears in my dreams. I don't always, but sometimes I get to hold her and have the sensation of feeling her body in my arms again.
Yeah, so that's the memories of embodied physical aspects of people, loved ones, and others, and then also the ways that we actually embody those memories.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Later in that essay, to quote you to yourself, you write, "We're all to one degree or another made of what we call memory, not only the bits and pieces of time visible to us in pictures that have hardened with our repeated stories, but also the memories we embody and don't understand."
Yes, I mean, if you think about, different kinds of memory, and a lot of this has been, parsed in scholarly ways, but there are real embodied memories that don't have an autobiographical component, right? And everyone is familiar with Proust's Madeleine, right? The memories that come through taste and smell. I remember once looking at a bowl that had oranges in it in my kitchen, and the sun was shining on it, and the citrus smell was coming up, and I was transported back to my childhood in Norway, skiing in the mountains, because at Easter time, the sun is shining, it's very warm. Lots of times you can ski in t-shirts, and we always had packed lunches, and there was always an orange, and the orange would get hot in that sun, and that smell would come up. It was a completely Proustian business, right? That the senses take you into another place, and it's a memory that you don't trigger. It's a memory that comes inadvertently.
This is quite uncanny, because when I was 15, well before I had read Proust, I was walking home from school and I was peeling a tangerine, and it was not on the ski slopes in Norway, and it was not warm. It was a cold day in suburban Long Island. And I was peeling this tangerine, and it struck me because I smelled it, and I stopped walking, and I didn't know what was happening. And what was happening was that I was wholly inhabited by a very vivid sensory memory of when we lived in Israel when I was 7 years old, next to an orange orchard. And my memory of that time is just a warm yellow and the smell of the orange orchard, and it came back to me. So in very different circumstances. And later I read Proust, or my English teacher told me about Proust, and I was able to put conceptual architecture around it, but the sensory experience came first.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I mean, because that's the way, there's no reason to think that that stops. I mean, that's not the way we always experience memory, but I wonder why it is that so often the vivid memories of childhood are the ones that make that so real to us.
Yes, well, I guess, in childhood, you haven't lived so long. And I think many of these memories are emotionally marked, right? We have a tendency to forget what we don't care about. If those ski trips and that orange orchard, if we hadn't cared about them, we probably wouldn't have been transported back to them.
And I know that you can tell us the neuroscientific, the state of neuroscientific research into the ways that memories are encoded with emotion.
Yeah, it does seem to be true, even on a molecular level, that emotion consolidates memory, and it also reconsolidates memory, right? So memories change. There's no original engram in the brain. We don't have a hard drive up there. Many other thinkers have talked about this, Bergson, Freud. It turns out they were right. But it's also important that what we don't care about, we forget. I like to say indifference is the swiftest route to amnesia. So.
I'm sorry, what was that? No, just kidding.
Whoa.
Yeah, but then there's this, so we have this mutual imbrication. So we're talking about the phenomenological experience, and you address it by, through your own, recounting your own lived experience and memory and different points in your life, and then bringing in perspectives from neuroscientific research and philosophy. But it's tricky because writing is something that is, as you also talk about in other essays in this collection, reading transports one, but it's not in itself a sensory medium.
No. No, although, it's very interesting too. I mean, this is a little science again, but even reading metaphors, especially metaphors that haven't gone completely dead, people will have, associated brain parts, to make this simpler, are activated by, he had a rough day. So reading is also an embodied experience, and it's probably more tactile and sensual than we often imagine, right? It's not just happening up here.
Certainly, yes, and you write about this in this collection as well. Just to return for a second to, I'm just thinking about this question of how we have an embodied experience of memory, and you articulate this in so many different ways and through so many different stories in the collection. And here's another passage from this same first essay talking about secrets. Secrets traveled in the family, secrets heavy with emotion. I felt they were like stones stored in hidden pockets in a big man's overcoat, and wearing that coat meant being weighed down by shame. So you give this, what one could think of as an abstract notion of a secret, you give it a material form. It's very vivid.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I realized actually after I was, putting these essays together, is that, secrets are of course what's missing, what's unsaid. But nevertheless, there's a feeling of their presence. Many families have this in different ways. And I think, I come from a Norwegian American family. My mother was Norwegian, didn't come to the United States until she was over 30. My father was Norwegian American. Scandinavians, if anyone's read Ibsen out there, right? There's a lot of withholding, but you can feel the presence of withholding. And one of the themes that returns in the book is that we can't ignore omission, right? That omission can be just as important as what's spoken or what's, or commission, so to speak. I'm really interested in this, both, intellectually and in private stories about families.
Yes, I felt that was a real through line to the collection, and it interests me as well. I've always been pulled toward this in ways that I don't yet fully understand why. So I was really drawn in by that. And I think that one of the articulations, again, it's pretty early on in that first essay. We'll just talk about the first, no. When you're talking about your grandfather, Lars Hustvedt, is that vaguely correct pronunciation?
Yeah,
and as you describe it, that he was born in the US, right?
Yeah, both of them were. Both my paternal grandmother and grandfather were both born the children of immigrants in the United States in the late 1880s. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about your grandfather's relationship to his own father's homesickness?
Yeah. So my grandmother, the one who I wrote the essay about, never got to Norway, but my grandfather, when he was 70, inherited some money. They were very poor. I mean, this is all also part of the essay. He inherited some money and he went to Norway for the first time. Now, because his own father had described the Hustvedt farm to my grandfather in painstaking detail, when he arrived in a place called Voss in Norway, he stupefied his relatives by walking around the place and pointing out everything. So, he had a great success in Norway. And I have to tell you, speaking of immigrant communities, both of my grandparents spoke English with a heavy Norwegian accent, as did my father to the day he died. And, that's a third generation.
He was born in the US and yet he spoke with a thick.
And so did my grandparents, who were also born in the US. So it was my great grandparents on that side that came from Norway, and my mother, who was an immigrant herself.
So as you write about your grandfather, that he was, quote, homesick for a home that wasn't home, but rather an idea of home.
That's right. I think these strange forms of displacement that are inherited across generations is something that's truly interesting.
And how do you feel, how would you describe your own inheritance of that, if at all?
Well, I think if I hadn't had a Norwegian mother to reinforce all of that, it probably would have leaked away, as it has for many people of my generation. But because I had a Norwegian mother, spoke Norwegian, that part of myself became strong. And the more I've thought about it, having a bilingual background, I think of many people who have more than 2 languages, but I only had 2, that having more than one language gives you the possibility of multiple perspectives, a kind of pluralism that monolingual children don't have in the same way. And I think that's influenced me all my life. I am, as I like to say, an epistemological pluralist. I believe that there are many ways of knowing, and that it depends on your situation and where you're standing. And this, for me, it is a call to what is now called interdisciplinarity, or, being able to occupy different disciplines and different ways of knowing, and respecting those different ways of knowing.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Proust quote, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." And so you were born with two pairs of eyes, at least. Yeah, there's something about that, having that baked in understanding of multiplicity, because there's very little that comes before, language, to have two languages. And of course, the thoughts and concepts and things that are expressible in some languages, but in others. And related to that, though, and I wonder, going back to this idea of a homesickness for a home that wasn't home, I was thinking about, I recently moved, so I don't have access. I have all these books of, untranslatable dictionaries.
Yeah. I have one of those too.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
And the one word that came to mind, my German is really poor, but the Fernweh, far sickness. I don't know if it's quite that. It has to be a longing for something one never had, strictly speaking. Maybe there's a word in Norwegian that you could.
Yeah, I was just trying to think that. I can't think of it. I'm no doubt someone will come up with it for me tomorrow. But
Well, you'll think of it as soon as we sign this.
But yeah, no, and I mean, there are these beautiful, actually German has quite a few emotional words.
It's so cheating, because to make the word, all they have to do is take the whole sentence.
I know.
Yeah.
They just glue them together. Yeah. And we use some of them, zeitgeist is now an English word, but we don't have an English equivalent for that, right?
Yeah, right. So we've just absorbed it. Schadenfreude.
We just borrowed it.
Yeah.
Or Schadenfreude. I
Yeah.
think people use this too, right? These are feeling words that we don't have.
Yeah. Yeah. So this kind of dislocation of home being, I'm sticking with this home theme, the home being something to which one is attached, but is perhaps a representation of home. So as you say, an idea of home. And I was reminded of the work of Andre Aciman, who explores this theme quite a bit. In particular, this short story of his that I love called Arbitrage. I think it was from 2000. And I pulled up a quote from him that was in an interview. It's an article from Gigantic Magazine. So let me just quote a little bit. And before I do, just to be clear, obviously your experience is distinct from his. So I'm not trying.
No, we're
right. Yeah. So he said, quote, "We exist on so many tenses that to pretend we're in the present is just claptrap. We're constantly shifting like tectonic plates between one tense and another, which is why I think we have a hard time living. As a writer of fiction, I'm more interested in what characters feel over time than in what they feel in an absolute moment." And there again, you might sort of hear the echo of my dislike of realism, this tradition of depicting the world journalistically at a very specific moment. It is a biased and purblind way of looking at things, because things always seem, they never are. And here, just to break out for a second, here I'm reminded of, we only ever have an idea of home or a representation, perhaps, right? So anyway, to go on with the quote, "The past intrudes on everything we do." Again, just to echo what I've said, our dreams are total fantasy, total memory, total anticipation, total fear, total hope. And we bicker with ourselves all the time. Every person is always tussling with the covenants of time because we're never grounded. I, Andre Aciman, am luckier than most other writers because I have a story of not being grounded, of being deracinated and dislodged. and that story was handed over to me ready-made, which gives me a kind of right to speak to this. But in fact, I was always deracinated, and I was never in the moment, even before I was officially deracinated from my home in Egypt. I'm in exile from a place I never loved, so I'm always in the wrong country, and I'm always living in the wrong century, and everything is always wrong. Writing is the only place I've got, the only thing I know how to do. The only tense I know is the tense of writing, and that's not the present.
Yeah. Well, I think, of course, it's a way of talking about time, something that fascinates me deeply, and of course is not solved. But William James, who influenced Edmund Husserl, both of them wrote really well about time, and it echoes your paragraph there, because the present, is not a point, right? I mean, Husserl makes this very clear when he's writing about time consciousness, and he uses a melody so that you're always dragging the past with you and anticipating what's coming next. And again, actually, this seems to be very close to very recent models in neuroscientific research, which is that, our brains are always predicting the future from what they call priors. And so that notion, what James called the specious present, really doesn't exist. And human beings, I mean, we human beings, there's an essay in the book called The Future of Literature, which I was called upon to write for an event that happened in Oslo.
Just a modest title.
Yeah, modest title, right? Well, it becomes very clear in the essay that I have no predictions for the future of literature, and I'm not pretending to know. At the same time, the future is a hugely important concept for human beings, because we're constantly tumbling into it in what we speciously call the present, right? And how do we make that fictional future? We make it from past experience.
Well, and we understand the past also through the frame of the present, right?
Through the frame, well, yes. So our past, this is another thing, Freud used that nice word, Nachträglichkeit, that was translated by Strachey as deferred action, which is really not very nice translation, even though Strachey made many nice choices, but that wasn't one of them. I think it would be nice to call it afterleiness.
Yeah.
So that our afterleiness is reshaping the past as well, which means that the imagination plays a gigantic role in memory, and in predicting the future, and in how, obviously we experience works of art.
And that we know this through our experience. What I love is that you bring in your knowledge of and your scholarship in neuroscience, and yet it's not you don't offer it as the only evidentiary proof. We experience.
No, and I don't believe that, and actually in other works, I mean, there's a 200-page essay called The Delusions of Certainty that in my last essay book, A Woman Looking at Men, Looking at Women. And there, my sort of now many, many years of familiarity with neuroscience and its trajectory has made me, a real critic of certain models in the field. So no, I think it's a big mistake and I mean, you, I know, are a comrade in this thinking through narrative medicine, which is that it's really important to think about literature, history, philosophy, and science as forms of knowledge, but not to treat certain, physics or neuroscience as the end all of all knowledge, which the culture can often do.
It's really challenging because there's this claim to authority that's right there, to say, well, but here's the substantiation for this claim, and here's the scientific research. It's nice to have authority. It's nice to have one's views, but
Yes,
we're,
of course. And everyone is aware of these hierarchies at the same time. But in another essay in the novel, I really talk about how the gene has been used as a contemporary version of the eternal soul. And that this is in error of biology, that the gene is the real me. And if you look at embryology, for example, and the course of human gestation, it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And there are parts of science that have actively reinforced genetics as the eternal soul, neo-Darwinism in particular. And again, I'm opposed.
Yeah, but it's, I'm glad that we're in this together. At least we have company.
Yeah.
And to everybody watching, the particular essay in the collection that speaks to this quite directly is called Open Borders, Tales from the Life of an Intellectual Vagabond. And again, as I read it, I felt very grateful to have a fellow vagabond, and the challenges, but then one can reap the benefits of having no one disciplinary home. And as you write, and as I agree, that then it gives the possibility to really think with a fresh perspective about the assumptions and premises of any given discipline or discourse.
Yes, I think what happens if you are a roamer, or if you have a kind of marginal status that I certainly have in just about everything, that marginal status is, of course, a disadvantage in many ways. And the advantage, however, is the ability to ask dumb questions at times. And sometimes those dumb questions end up being rather central. In other words, that you can interrogate the foundations on which some of these disciplines are resting, and also come to recognize the differences among and between disciplines. So that, for me, has given me a kind of flexibility of mind now in my 66th year, soon to be switching over to my late 60s. I still count 66 as mid. Anyway.
Totally, yeah.
Anyway, so that is, I think, really important, and it does run through this text, not in a tremendously, I think, heavy way. I wanted all of these essays to be, lucid and not about specialization of any kind.
Yes, I think it succeeds on that basis. I know in reading them, I was thinking of other works of yours that went into greater detail or chose to take a more scholarly tone. I think you have something in the afterword about your decision not to include source citations or footnotes. Was that in order to try?
Right. Well, I was going through essays, and I have another bunch of essays that I may publish them with a scholarly or academic press, because they have to have footnotes. They go into much more specialized material, but I didn't want this book to be that book, right? So I wanted them to keep those two separate, even though I have to say, thematically and my interests, keep coming back. It's not as if those texts are completely on different themes. Many of them were delivered as lectures at conferences where you were addressing an audience that knew whatever that field happened to be.
Right. Well, it's not surprising that there would be thematic connections. You are, after all, one person, right? So
I am one person, or yeah.
I just want to say we're going to turn to questions just in a few moments. So for our audience members, please feel free to think about questions that you might want to ask and to put them in the Q&A. And we will try to get to as many of them as we can. But while I still have you, I just want to return to this theme that I'm so struck by of the home and representations of home and longing for home and the way that it plays out in so many different ways in this collection. One is the in the essay about, it's called Mentor Ghosts, writing about mentorship. You write that the overwhelming feeling I have to this day on the subject of mentors is that I never came home. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the mentor essay is really saying that I never really had one and that I wanted one. And I point out, however, that mentors are in a way chosen parents, right? We don't choose our parents, we're born, and that's it. So those familial relations are made. But later in life, when people go seeking a mentor, or there's someone in a position to take a younger person under his or her wing, that is a kind of artificial parenthood. So I do relate my longing for a mentor, especially to paternal authority. And, bring up my own father, who was a professor, in relation to that. And I end up actually saying that I'm rather glad that I never found one. I was rebuffed time after time. It was like, no, not you. What that was, I'm probably not intellectually sophisticated enough to know exactly why nobody wanted me. But in the end, I think that seeking of the artificial parent, if you will, is not a bad thing. I'm not, dumping on everyone who seeks mentorship or mentors, hardly. But it was probably better for me that I didn't succumb to that kind of paternal authority that I actually wanted in some way. I didn't get it. So I had to do without it. And I suspect that was a good thing.
Yeah, it's again, it's the problem of omission in action, because you're writing about the lack of a thing, but then what does that reveal?
Yes.
As an open question.
Yeah.
Speaking of open questions, let's turn now to the Q&A. And let's see. Here's a question from Janet. She writes, would you comment further on dream connection with relatives? And she also writes, how often do you return to Norway?
Well, I'll answer the first part first. I mean, the last part first. Before the pandemic, I had been in Norway really many times, both for familial reasons, because I have lots of cousins and relatives in Norway. And I was doing various lectures at the University of Oslo. I was actually at a Margaret Cavendish conference lecturing. So I was there often, and I'm really missing it. The dreams are, of course, very interesting. After my grandmother, my actually maternal grandmother, someone I was close to as well, when she died, after she had died, I had a dream visitation that was very moving. I think people often have this. She didn't come back after that. And after my father died, I had extremely vivid dreams, actually for many, many years, that my father was still alive. Sometimes those were troubled dreams. So I think that, dreams too seem to be emotionally driven. And no one knows exactly how they work. In fact, the theories about dreams are so conflicted, and there's absolutely no consensus. But I do think I'm very interested in dreams and dreaming, and I think that writing, I often think, especially writing fiction, but writing is a form of dreaming while awake, that you're drawing on these images that are often more economical and potent than you really know. I mean, I often feel I'm not directing my writing, but it's directing me. I feel that the book knows more than I do, and I just have to kind of follow it. And dreams, of course, are not willed, but they are stories that we spontaneously invent. And as I said, the economics of those stories are often, quite brilliant.
That's what makes writing so singular. It's by very nature giving form to something, and yet at the same time trying to remain as open as possible to
Yeah. Things happen, right? I mean, you're just like, you're surprised. I'm working on a novel now, and things happen, and you kind of decide if that's how it has to be.
Yeah. Speaking of dreams, we didn't talk about this essay much, but I was so deeply moved by the essays about your mother, and the part where you say that she came to you after she died, that she came to you in a dream and that you were waiting for her.
I was. I mean, I guess, I felt actually I waited rather long. I thought, I think the day after my father died, I had a very vivid dream about him. But I waited a couple of months, and the joy, I felt in the dream that, there she was. And when I woke up, I thought, well, she finally came, and she's come, a number of times since, but that's really the joy.
Yeah. Wonderful. Here's another question. Okay, here we go. Thank you for diving into multilingualism and translation and untranslatability. You're welcome. Thinking about what you said regarding omission and linking it to the idea of untranslatable, would you say the body could fill the gap? The words may be, quote, impossible to translate, but the emotions, part of the human experience, always exist in all the different languages. How do we solve this untranslatability in writing? And what role can we give the body in this process? Just a little question for you to.
Yeah, this is, of course, a brilliant question that, I cannot really answer, but it's a question that I think is really important. In cognitive science, people talk about bottom up and top down, right? So the top down is coming in, and the bottom up is this kind of species being, as Marx called it. That I love that phrase. I have kind of stolen it from Karl Marx and used it in a somewhat different way. But we do have a human species being, and there are a kind of repertoire of feeling. The question really is, the culture also is involved in creating some of those feelings, right? You see this I read somewhere that there were 101 different words for shame in Mandarin. Now, that means that in some way, of course, the language is making possible subtleties of feeling about shame that we probably don't have, right? So I attend a meeting every 2 weeks, and it's a group of philosophers and scientists and and me. We're 9, and we talk about this a lot. And a philosopher friend of mine called me after the meeting, and she said, we really have to start talking about, you know, the bottom up and the top down. And she said, this is it, Siri. How far down does does the top down go, right? Well, this is an unanswerable question, and we both started laughing. But this is that place that I think a lot of contemporary thinkers want to occupy between what used to be called social constructivism, right? That everything is socially constructed. We're just kind of texts, and the culture is playing on us. And there isn't this animal, mammalian, biological being. And the way forward is I think to think about both of those aspects of the social animal that we are, in more refined ways. So the untranslatable is part of that question, and it's an enormous question, but I think an important one. I have another friend. She's both a neuroscientist and a philosopher, and she's been doing a lot of work on touch. This neglected. They're big on the neglected thing. So what's left? It's touch, taste, and smell have been kind of shunted aside for seeing and hearing. And she's very interested in, early touch and how this influences, human beings, and this is obviously part of our species being. No human infant can survive without being touched and held.
I think that was quite a good answer.
Okay, good. The top down and the bottom up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm reminded of, and I know I'm misappropriating this because it's about infinite regress, but the phrase is turtles all the way down. Like the world is on top of a turtle,
Yes,
but it's underneath
yes.
the turtle, and it's turtles all the way down. And
Yes.
that's so confusing that it's a good answer to a question like this, because but in all seriousness, to your point, and this relates to my work as well, that the idea that biology and social constructions would be always already intermingled, in my view, how could it be otherwise? Like, what's so
Right.
surprising
But
about that?
it's very, you do have to, I think, push against certain ideas of, for example, that our biology is some kind of fixed state. And I do talk about that in one of the essays. What we're talking about are biological processes, right? That are influenced, or even, I don't even like the word interaction, right? Because it implies that there are separate things. And you see that this in epigenetics, you see it in immunology, you see it in all these different fields, how you cannot extract one thing from the other. And also it's not static.
Mhm.
Biology is the least static thing in the world, right? We're just constantly changing and moving. And there is homeostasis, right? We have a conservative part of biology, but even that conservation or that homeostatic reality is adjustment. It's also in motion, right? It's not that you're just returning to some static state.
Right. And to make a big leap from there, but maybe not so big, to what we're speaking about with interdisciplinarity, I've heard the point that even the phrase interdisciplinarity also reifies or reinscribes the disciplines
Right.
being
Yeah.
distinct. And in
Yeah.
fact, that's the premise that we're actually interested in clarifying or challenging.
Right, right.
Okay, well, now that we've gotten all of this sorted out,
We fixed it all.
yeah, you're welcome, everyone. We've got it all figured out. Claire, would you like to reappear?
What a wonderful conversation. Thank you both so much.
Well,
was
thank
lovely.
you, Claire,
So
for
much.
inviting us.
Yeah, no, thank you for being here. And thank you for everyone out there for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about Siri's book and purchase it on harvard.com or in the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night. Keep reading and please be well. Thank you all so much. Good night.
Bye-bye.